Welcome back. Character focus, Primula. Alas, we come to our penultimate character study and probably our penultimate episode. Knowing where to place Primula in this essay was a little tricky. For one, I maintain that she's in truth the main core of the anime, in that she mirrors each character's struggles in some way and straight up narrates the final episode's epilogue. Furthermore, her arc forms the show's main climax and action set piece in episode 15. With all that said, putting a focus on her too early would require describing a great deal of scenes we had yet to reach, and that is something important. Primula never stops developing throughout the course of the show. It's what makes her a great and highly engaging character. I've chosen to place her exploration here as her role in episode 22 can be baffling for those who haven't been paying attention. Plus, we've covered the bulk of the steps towards her development now. As I mentioned quite some time earlier, way back in episode 6 for that matter, Primula pays homage to many of her predecessors in more ways than one. Coming back to the narrator idea, this is quite a prevalent trope in older anime, wherein the youngest character takes the role of narrator in some fashion. Heck, even in the West, things like the dub of Digimon made Kari the narrator. This is, in my view, to do with the idea of the youthful pair of eyes, the adventurous escapist spirit that the shows are often marketed towards, with an air of the unreliable narrator to top it off. Rather famous examples of this would be Ruri in Martian's successor Nadesco, who goes on to be the lead character in the much maligned follow-up movie. Rei Ayanami in Evangelion takes this role in a way only Eva could have come up with. And within the years to come, shows like Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya would do much to the similar effect with Yuki Nagata. Aside from this making for a nice reference to other properties, or how it's a neat to call out Primula's parallels to her fellow cast members, it plays a more important role when looking at her character. She by far develops the most of all the characters, being almost unrecognisable by the end, and this is because she starts at ground zero. Primula is deliberately a small, mute, blank child at the series' onset, so of course her many struggles would have the most impact on her. As such, when we talk about Primula, her core tenets of development are that of growing up, the struggling of fitting in during adolescence, the themes of neglect paired with found family and feelings of a lack of self-worth. Like with Rin, we've already discussed most of this, so it's more a case of pulling all the strands together now. Child neglect we've most recently touched on. It's a topic the show rather appropriately handles as a B-plot. We see it during the first arc, and biggest early indicator to it would appear to be when Rin discovers Primula's lack of undergarments. However, arguably this is a theme introduced in the girl's very first on-screen appearance. As early as episode 2, we witness Primula simply wandering the rainy streets of the town. With retrospect, it's clear by the gods' reaction that she was wandering off on her own accord, while later they imply they possibly let her escape in order to meet Rin as something of a social experiment. Another interesting example of the manipulation directed towards Primula. The fact is, she's clearly someone who has the mentality of a child, lightly dressed, wandering the streets of a strange location under a strange sky. There's something else to be gleaned from her initial scene too. Rin doesn't obtain her the plushie from the claw machine. I love this detail as even in her first moments of spotlight, Rin is letting her down. It's not really his fault, but it plays heavily into her character. No one cares. She's always the neglected child. Further in her backstory, as discussed at some length prior, the demons created her not to be unkind, but because if she dies during experimentation, no one would mourn her. On their part, it does suggest some remorse for what they perceive as the death of the first test subject during the first infinite magica experiments. However, what's key to us is the fact that her creation was a result of a need for someone who was both malleable and disposable, but ultimately was done out of a strange form of kindness. Even now we're not done. Next we have Licorice. Again, we've already discussed her prior, but the point is, despite being the only one to show Primula any real kindness during her stunted childhood, Licorice eventually chooses to save her sister Narine, and in doing so she abandons Primula, her kindred sister, to a life of isolation and loneliness. This comes to what should be ahead in the Kaide arc, where we see Primula's depravity in the background of the Furio arc. However, something interesting here is the resolution to it. Primula in this arc is the one who always is there for Kaide, not the other way around. There's no real moment where Kaide or Rin apologizes to Primula. Instead, she gets up on her own 2 feet and tries to rectify the situation by herself. This proves to be a more common motif for her than you might think. After all, she followed Narine into the real world, under her own agenda to see what the man that Licorice loved was like. Primula acts, to the best of her abilities, to be an independent, repeatedly. This is added to by the fact she isn't a member of the harem until around episode 22, but is still a primary cast member, which puts her in a peculiar position by rom-com anime standards. past her neglect, we have her struggles to fit in. This applies to her lack of humanity, her absence of family, and her totally empty reservoir of self-worth. Rather than pointing out again how this parallels the others, let's reacquaint ourselves with how it affects Rimu. She is for all intensive purposes speciesless, not human, not wholly demon or god, but some kind of hybrid machination. This proves quite the struggle for her, as she's created absent of any real personality, and her attempts to make connections end in heartbreak. This leads us to an interesting aspect of her character, the deconstruction of the Lolita archetype. I preambled about this somewhere near the top of the essay, but I don't think Shuffle is a deconstruction anime, but rather that it has elements of the genre, and maybe nowhere more so than in Primula. Putting aside her characterization for a moment, on a meta-narrative level, the show seems to be saying quite a bit with her presentation, like how the Licorice's backstory makes Narane's reason for liking Rin a more valid one, or how the show turns the old parents away on a business trip into a major narrative role. Primula is given some fairly heavy reasons for existing the way she does. The idea of the deadpan lolly being as such because of a grim backstory is not uncommon, but Shuffle is definitely an interesting example of it because of the meta implications. Referencing Nadesco's Ruri again, she's deadpan because she's an AI interface, as confirmed to us almost immediately within that story. So it's definitely not new, but what is the way it's used to explore lolly culture. We've mentioned at length how Primula's clothes change to match any given situation. The same can be said with how she's drawn. Depending on the tone of the scene and the artist at the helm, Primula is often depicted with longer legs or a more pronounced chest. Conversely, the inverse occurs frequently as well. This is another one of the show's use of animation abuse. In the real world, changing the proportions of a woman would be tricky and needlessly expensive to do justice, but here it can be done with ease. But why, you might ask? Well, one of the questions Shuffle asks its otaku audience is, what about these archetypes is it that you like? Do you like that Kaede is dedicated to the point of desperation? Do you like how Sia flaunts her body despite her lack of self-confidence in her personality? Do you like that Primula is childlike? To say it again, the show isn't so much criticizing you as it is trying to get you to ask yourself these questions. If you're a lolicon fan, then why? The aesthetic, the age, or maybe the personality? It can seem foreign nowadays in a time where lolly characters appear to be getting progressively smaller, more childlike and worryingly incestual. But back in the 90s and 2000s, lolly had a different meaning. A fan term coined based off the Russian book Lolita, lolly didn't necessarily describe a child, though it could. But because the word child already existed for that, instead it described an aesthetic of character. Somewhat unique in that other fan terms like tsundere we use as shorthand for an anime personality, lolly refers to an aesthetic choice. As such, the 2000s in particular are known for a whole host of iconic lolly tsunderes: Taiga, Louise, Nagai, Shana, Nagisa, Ayu, and Shinobu's Rika, along with most of the cast of Higurashi, are just some of the leading same-age lolly roles that spring to mind. However, the term back then didn't refer to children, as some have appropriated it to mean in more recent times. This is in itself alone makes Primula's depiction even more interesting, as the questions she's asking seem more relevant now today with modern lollies than ever before. Primula isn't here to judge her fans. Much like the others, she's here to help, mostly young men in this case, think through some rather complicated adolescent feelings of wish fulfillment. The show isn't trying to paint you as wrong for liking the idea of Primula or Kaede, but instead wants to convey how damaging an ideal that might be for the girl in question. There's nothing wrong with fantasizing about a perfect dere housewife, but what's important is that you remember that vision would, in reality, be a person with their own feelings and emotions, and that's what leads us to the point of Primula's more deconstructive side. What would a lolly be like in real life? The show gets you to consider the terrible events that would make someone that deadpan and emotionless. It points out their lack of common sense and their feelings of worthlessness. That idealized vision of purity would in reality be just a girl trying to fit in. However, as we've mentioned, Shuffle is never content not to offer an alternative, and as such we see Primula change over the course of the series. It's crucial that she only considers herself romantically attracted to Rin in the final act of the show, because only then is she a fully fledged person. The show is saying it's fine to find a fully consenting person of your own age appealing, but that you must look past the idealized idea of that person, to identify if what you're looking for or aiming for is something healthy for everyone that's involved. Like the others, Primula is painted in many different lights. Some people like the idea of a weak partner who can be rescued, yet Shuffle points out just how much damage that does to a person. I already mentioned the effects of being emotionally vapid, and the idea of the ideal family unit is brought heavily into question. The show isn't trying to judge anyone. It isn't going around calling people pedophiles or other hollow buzzwords and rhetoric. It's simply asking you to consider the often harsh reality behind the fantasy. That is, in the sense, the core element of the whole show, and all its fantasy allegories, whether they be to do with the cancerous sicknesses or the lollies. It's another reason why Primula acts as the show's heart, by being the most representative of this idea. My apologies if this segment feels more rigid in tone than the rest. To my own shame, I find myself a little fatigued with the topic of Lolita and Shota depictions in anime at the moment. For those reading this as my first piece of work, off the back of the recent fractures the inspired trend chaser of a YouTuber, Noralities, has perpetuated, I found myself experiencing firsthand the intolerance of modern anime discourse, and being rather rudely awakened to the fact that some perfectly logical and intelligent, analytical even, people will dismiss an entire anime production for the inclusion of a lolly or a shota. The idea that normal, reasonable people are so intolerant to even having a civil discussion about these awkward topics without the use of shallow rhetoric like pedophile has been genuinely quite disheartening. So it is with my utmost apologies that this segment isn't my best explained. Primula has always been, for me, one of the best written parts about Shuffle. Despite a small enough screen presence, she's a complex and highly developed character, used to deliver a variety of good messages, both meta and otherwise. If you have an interest in more of my thoughts on this matter, you can read my Super Lovers review here on Mal. A slightly earlier version of this is also available on the Mal blog page. Thanks for understanding. Moving away from how, the depiction of what can be seen as harmful things like Lolita and Shuffle or Shota can actually be used to help young audiences work through strange and complex sexual desires and fantasy fulfillment, let's get back to Primula's development, which isn't a straight line. She starts fragile but determined to find Rin. Then she attempts to resist returning to the demon world but gives in for Rin, Kaede and Narane's collective saints. Then she finds herself a family, only to follow that by once more being neglected, as she makes desperate attempts to appease an increasingly uninterested Kaede and Rin. Nonetheless, she perseveres, eventually becoming Kaide's rock and forming herself into a fully fledged person. This growth she undergoes is wonderfully charted by the smaller moments. Her clothes, her cooking, and her consideration for others all change in small ways throughout and by the time of episode 22. Primula has finally begun to think for herself. The lessons she learns from episode 15 come to fruition. Indeed, episode 15 teaches Primula that despite the betrayal that Rin and Licorice pertained, she is loved by them both. It's another part of what's important, that it's not just Rin who saves her. And then through witnessing Kaide's struggles, she learns that in turn, there are people who need her, that she can be the Licorice Kaede needs in that moment. It's only through this continued development that Primula comes to appreciate what it means to be a human, that we all mess up and hurt one another, that we all do our best to support each other. It's once more a simple message, but it's only with this learn that she can move on. She has to first learn what love is in order to be in love. Like we discussed with Rin and Asa's confession scenes, a large part of Rimu's journey is to learn what love is. Licorice conveyed it to the girl with first the cat plushie, something which Rin would go on to reinforce with the second toy. And while this is a good way to explain it to a child, Primula needs to learn to appreciate it on a deeper kind of love, in order to develop into a more fully fleshed out person. She first learns heartbreak when Licorice dies and when Rin betrays her trust. But what she sees in episode 15 is how affection goes further than physical objects like teddy bears. But in standard Shuffle fashion, Rin has little to do with her learning curve. Licorice started it, but Kaede finishes it. After all, it's through Kaede that Primula comes to understand the difference between familial love and romantic love. This is why a fully developed Primula in episode 22 is capable of showing jealousy and envy towards the other girls vying for Rin's attention. She's no longer just a child, something which episode 24 confirms in a very literal sense, by giving us the information that she was always only a year or two at most younger than the rest of the cast. The point being that it was a question of her understanding the world that made her attraction to her immoral... It was a question of understanding of the world that made attraction to her immoral, not her age. When we speak of these things, age is almost never the important thing to discuss. To include our analysis of Primula, I actually find it quite hard to narrow down what exactly the message being conveyed by her character is. Where you can boil the others down to one overly simplistic sentence, Sia needs to love herself, Narane needs to live for herself, Kaede can find retribution, and Rin needs to learn the difference between what's right and what's right, Primula is a little more opaque to disconcert. On One reading could be that no matter your background, you can still aim to make the best of your life. Another might be to understand that even when you're neglected by the people you love, they may still care for you. One could look at the meta-elements and say the breakdown of the lolly genre is the message, or that it's a heartfelt metaphor for the struggles of growing up as a teenager, while trying to fit in, but being a little bit different. It could be one of trying to affect the changes in your life that you'd like to see in others, or maybe it's as simple as a message about growth. A combination, in a sense, of all those prerequisites, telling us that no matter the background, your individual struggles and shortcomings, no matter how many times you've been hurt or burned, you can still become a great person, still go on to be better than you once were. A message, if you will, about how we never stop changing and growing, as people in the best possible way. I personally have very little affinity for lolicon culture or lolly waifus. I don't really play the waifu game, but if I was asked who the best written lolly is, my mind will always arrive at Primula in quick succession. The extent of topics and morality conveyed by her is highly compelling, while still managing to have her be comic relief early on. She's a well-written character with some great intentions for the show's audience, and for that she may just be my favourite character of the whole show. Episode 22, A Bountiful Dream. As I alluded to in a previous segment, episode 22 can come across as a bemusing experience. The fan service is cranked up to 11, and the tone returns to that of the opening moments of the show's first few episodes. We get a return to the visual novel character bubbles, sound effects and all. Sia, or more precisely Kikokyo, is extremely sexual, and Primula and Narane don cat cosplay. As I also implied, the easy answer for all this is it's the reward. Rin's reward for actually manning up somewhat, for doing the best thing he could think of with the Kaide situation, and later making sure to give her closure while still trying his best to show his more brotherly affections before finally confessing his love to Asa. However, we can go a bit more in depth than just that, with a return to the quick-fire scenes game. For one, we have the opening scenes, for example, which automatically confers this is going to be a lighter episode when we witness Rin receiving back slaps aplenty from fellow students. It's a nice gag, but also serves to both reflect how much further Rin and Asa's relationship has become, while also it reminds us of the simpler times when Asa used to greet Rin with a similar slap on the way to school. The same scene also acts as a return to the aforementioned character bubbles. What follows on from this is a series of fluffy classroom scenes. It has been a while since we spent any significant time in the school. I quite appreciate the rather lengthy scene of Isuki, Mayumi and Rin simply chilling in the cafeteria. It's a nice reminder of these three's pre-existing bond from before the series opened, and furthermore, Isuki affords a nice moment of clarity when he compliments Rin in making the adult choice and choosing, respectfully, the one girl he actually felt romantically towards. This scene is also pretty funny, with Mayumi delivering a wonderfully animated punch while showing surprisingly good form. Something that isn't even a full scene but is worth quickly mentioning. Set cuts display Narane and Sia quaintly spending their lunch break with a separate group of friends. It's a nice touch and an easy way to communicate to us how the duo are moving further away from their infatuation with Rin, being their only motivation. My apologies, my delivery ain't great today. Next up is some great relationship building. People often praise shows like Golden Time for its portrayal of relationships that go further than the will they won't they phase. And I recently reviewed Horimiya, a show which was flaunted for much the same trait. However, here in Shuffle we get the same to very little fanfare. In the current scene, we see Asa and Rin happily spending time together in Rin's new apartment. Rin mentions how easy life's been up till now. It's a nice level of self-awareness considering how, to some degree, one would argue his life has been awful. But what he's accepting here is how easy Kaide has made it for him in more recent years. I also appreciate how Asa never offers to help with the money situation. After all, that would devalue his efforts and the weight of his independently made decisions. The scene is rounded out with a casual kiss, and casual is the important word there. In spite of Rin looking initially surprised, we get the impression that this is becoming a natural part of their lives, showing just how comfortable a partnership they have become in each other's company. There are a few shows that pull this off. Offhanded kisses all that well. There are a few shows that pull off offhanded kisses all that well, but here we have a great example of one doing just that. Next is one of the episode's only slow scenes, as we watch Kaide and Rin talk for the first time since the previous story. The implication of time passing between episodes 21 and 22, but it's clear Kaide is still bent out of shape, as Shuffle once again refuses to let her simply be fixed the moment her arc ends. This conversation is one of the show's most mature and ends in another quiet hug. Despite the episode's focus on the over-the-top fan service, the show is never foolish enough to extend that lightheartedness out as far as Kaide. This scene just proves how much more tactful it is than that. There's also some great voice acting by Kaide's voice actress. Now we come to the last big talking point of the episode, that final scene. To give context, Rin and Asa stand in a new apartment, looking out on the view of the town. The balcony door is open, which gives the scene a brilliant use of visual storytelling. Rin is framed behind the open glass door. As such, the clouds and the dusk skyline reflect across his visage. For him, life is now great. All his friends have found their answers and are on the path to recovery. He himself has found a new road to walk along, while meanwhile he's now with the girl of his dreams. His life is literally clear skies now. He's taken responsibility in his life, and all this episode has been his reward. But then, even now, we still have those unassuming clouds on the horizon, foreshadowing what's left to come in the show's remaining screen time. In stark contrast, Asa is framed by the open doorway, completely obscured by any clouds or sky of any kind. Representation of how her struggle is only just beginning, and reflective of how, despite how close they seem in physical proximity, they are still divided, and the hardships of life are actively vying to draw them apart. Like how the glass door frame standing between them literally separates them in the framing of the shot. Episode 22 heavily mirrors episode 12 in that we witness what seems to be a good end, a harem end even. Everyone has reached a relative point of equilibrium, but like with Primula once before, Asa falls foul to an almost identical illness. The last point is interesting. It plays into the point of this episode heavily. The conflict of Primula's arc was Rin's fault, in a sense all along, with that of Primula's illness, but this time Rin has done nothing wrong. He's done his best, done what he believed to be right, is trying to support his friends in a more productive manner, and to be a good boyfriend to Asa. And yet in the end she still falls ill, and that's part of the point. I compared Primula's sickness to the simile for cancer earlier on, and here we see that come back once again. In a manner of speaking, Asa falling sick is very true to life. Even if we do everything we can to help those around us and to be a good person, even if we beat the cancer once, you can never know when it will cruelly return, unannounced, untimely, and uninvited. It's all the more painful because of the fact that Rin has finally done the right thing. Primula breaking felt like an inevitability, but Asa, while equally is down to no one, it's no one's fault that Asa's ill, we feel as powerless as Rin is about to become. This mirroring of episode 12 is present in more than that, however. Like 12, we see the happy end portrayed in a slightly unnatural way. Sure, it's less tragic and the characters have worked through most of their issues, but there's an intentional dissonance in how obtrusive the fan service is. The characters come off like they're in a classic harem. Kikyo acts like a true sexual deviant. Primula, though true totally in character, can come across as out of character. And even Narane seems out to impress Rin. Sure, things have moved far past episode 12, but we still aren't quite there. This is still a fantasy, and episode 22 does an amazing job of displaying that fact to great, if not a little confusing on the first watch, effect, while also never stepping out of line. Kaide is still recovering, Primula is still finding her personality, Narane and Sia are shown developing outside of the main group, and despite all the tumultuous fan service, even in the most intentionally lustful of episodes, the show never uses nudity as a joke. Not one nudity shot is used in this episode, despite it being undeniably the most fan-servicey episode. So now maybe it's time we properly address that final point. Team, maturity in nudity. Now, here's a topic I first addressed right back at the start of this elongated essay. Let's take a moment to put on our schoolboy analysis writing skills and tackle this team head-on rather than in my usual roundabout manner. As the theme of the story, it's one thoroughly grounded in Japanese culture, whose perception of nudity varies greatly from our own versions of it over here in the bulk of Western countries. For one thing, censoring nudity is a relatively new concept to the country, only becoming a regulation post the year 2000, which stands in a marked contrast to our own Ofcom standards boards and the likes of them. For an easy example, just watch older anime, and you'll be surprised how often a child or even a fully grown woman is in, say, a Gundam series will be suddenly naked for a few seconds of shot. Not even for the purpose of fan service, mind you. Gurren Lagann makes something of a meta joke about this, with a whole mini-episode of the spin-off series, Parallel Works, being dedicated to a naked version of a young Dari. This all stems from an expectation, one that all upstanding citizens should hold the naked form in a sense of sincerity and reverence. something which, in the last couple of decades, the Japanese government finally seems to have realised might be a misplaced trust in their idealised image of humanity, so apparently adept at personal responsibility, but nonetheless makes for an interesting part of anime's history. For our purposes, on the other hand, we have Shuffle's frequent use of nudity, and is indeed regular, not to the level of something like High School DxD. Indeed, I'd almost hesitate to put an ecchi tag on the property, were it not for the nudity scenes. Yet, as mentioned, at large, Shuffle never uses these scenes for titillating fan service. Instead, when a bra is lost, we as the audience are expected to acknowledge and be mature enough to realise that it's a signal for us to pay attention rather than to be aroused. Might seem like a foreign, contradictory concept to many of us, but nudity is such an important part of all our lives that Shuffle expects any display of it to make you consider its secondary meaning. Maybe the best way to illustrate this is with some examples. Of these is episode 11, just the whole thing, to be honest. We've only glossed over it so far, but during the course of the episode we follow Mayumi and Miss Mao as they go on a heavily fan service filled mini adventure. On the surface it acts as an icebreak in between the more sombre episodes 10 and 12, and as a cushion before the show takes on a regular darkened subject matter in general. This alone is something I love, especially as it gives time to some characters who are somewhat less served in the anime than their visual novel counterparts might have been. But there's more at work here from our perspective. The plot of the episode is mainly Mayumi in specific, losing her underwear and her mission to both work a shift in a maid cafe and then to recover said undergarments. This is not only the show's most complicated plot. This is not the show's most complicated plot. However, despite the prime opportunity to sneak in some grotesque opie shots, it never does. In fact, despite a myriad of softcore shots, the only nudity comes right at the end of the episode, when Mao and Mayumi take a bath in her family's hot spring. Here the two are on screen naked, but importantly the tone of the scene is completely different to everything from before. Now the music is more calm, the framing less sexual, and the two characters simply talk about the mundanity of life. It's somber, though to a lesser extent than to much of the other scenes I've referenced. But in an episode spent solely being comedy-driven, the sudden change to actual full-blown uncensored fan service heralds a more serious moment in the story. We also previously spoke about how the inclusion of a see-through bra scene for Primula helped to accentuate the severity of that scene. There we saw how Rin, and by proxy the audience, don't react with arousal, but instead with embarrassment at the realisation they've let the girl down. Like I said before, the scene wouldn't hit as hard without this clarity and lack of ambiguity, and so it shouldn't be surprising that this is her only nudity scene in the whole show. During Kyokyo's episode 11, the date is brought to a sombering halt, going from comedy to drama when Kikyo flashes Rin and tries to proposition him with her body. As soon as she's actually presented herself openly to him, Rin, and ergo the viewer, is smacked in the face with how wrong, how messed up this situation is, to an extent doubly so for the viewer who knows Kikyo has stolen Sia's form. All this in spite of the fact that Sia is meant to be one of the our main on-to fan service characters. The show is using the reality that nudity offers in order to hammer home the severity, or sometimes just the importance of a scene. We see it again when Kaede offers herself to Rin. This scene hits with far more sincerity and desperation because she is actually on screen. Likewise, the same is appropriate with how most of Kaede's nudity moments. And finally, we have what I mentioned about in episode 22. Like 11, it's full of fan service, including the sexy older sister trope, cat-maid cosplay trope, and general girls fighting over the main guy activity. But throughout it all, they're never nude. Because the point of these scenes is both a further release of the rich, high-stakes tension of the previous three arcs, and as an embodiment of the faulty harem good end mentality of most harems and non-standard rom-com anime. If any of the fan service was presented with nudity, it would throw the whole thing off kilter, and it's in this way that the show not only proves that it only uses nudity for maturity, but manages to weaponize its own obscenity into something more adult. The really sad part about all this, with the prominent divide that's formed in the anime community around Dragon Maid, ReZero, SAO cancel culture, and almost everything Noralities' legion of parrot-like followers champion, combined with the elitism, hate culture, and gatekeeping the anime communities have always attracted and appealed to, many will go into Shuffle, seeing its ecchi or harem tag, and immediately decide there's no value to be had. They'll dismiss the whole show because of a lolly scene or minor nudity, all because they're unwilling to look past their preconceived notions and biases about their own country's politics or about their own opinions on any given genre tag. It's a shame, to put it lightly, that one would miss out on all the depth and subtext for a silly little reason like that. Nudity in shuffle is always used sparingly and for good reason, whether it's to accentuate the severity of a point or as a metaphor like in the advert's title card. It is constantly used to signal a change in tone or pacing to a masterful extent, and rather than degrading any scene it's included in, it instead manages to present itself as a prevailing sign of the show's, well, maturity. It's the end of this part. Next time we're going to be focusing on episode 23 and pretty much the end of the show, as well as a character focus on Ossa in the bumper, probably way too long to be reasonable final episode. Sorry if the delivery is anyways weak in this and the previous episode. These are probably two of the most important parts of the essay, but, you know, I guess timing is a bitch. Again, feel free to read them if you'd like a slightly better put version of this, and thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.